Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the life of Anne Catherine Emmerich, born in 1774. We begin in the quiet village of Flamschen, exploring her early years of poverty and her first reported mystical experiences as a child. Imagine, if you will, the landscape of Westphalia in the late 18th century. It is a place of low-hanging mists and quiet, rolling fields that stretch toward the horizon under a pale, silver sky. The air in Flamschen carries the scent of damp peat and the earthy, ancient musk of tilled soil. Here, life moved at the slow, deliberate pace of the seasons, dictated by the rising sun and the rhythmic tolling of distant church bells. In this small community of farmers and laborers, the boundaries between the physical world and the spiritual realm were thin, woven together by centuries of tradition, and an unwavering, simple faith that bloomed in the silence of the countryside. The cottage of her birth was a humble structure of timber and clay, its roof thick with thatch that gathered the winter frost and the summer dust alike. She was one of 9 children born to Bernard and Anne Hester Emmerich, poor peasants who spent their long days struggling to coax a living from the stubborn, heavy earth. Inside their small home, the light was often dim, provided only by a flickering hearth or a solitary tallow candle that cast long, dancing shadows against the walls. The floors were made of packed earth, cold beneath the feet of children who shared everything they had. In this environment of scarcity, every crust of bread was a blessing, and every chore was a form of silent prayer. Anne Catherine, even as a small child, possessed a delicate frame and a quiet, observant nature. While other children played, she was often found in a state of deep reflection, her eyes fixed on things the rest of the world could not see. By the time she was only 5 or 6 years old, the world around her began to transform in ways she could not yet explain to her family. While she tended to the family's sheep in the lonely, wind-swept pastures, she felt a presence as real as the grass beneath her feet or the rough wool of the animals. She did not feel solitary in those long hours of grazing under the vast German sky. Instead, she spoke later of a guardian angel who walked beside her, a luminous companion whose light offered a strange warmth against the biting winds. To the young Anne Catherine, these visitations were not unusual or frightening. In her innocent mind, she truly believed that every child saw the heavens opening above them at sunset, and that everyone held quiet, familiar conversations with the saints who appeared to her in the shimmering heat of the afternoon sun. She saw the landscape not just as dirt and stone, but as a living map of a divine kingdom. She would often describe seeing the Christ child as a playmate, a gentle boy who would sit with her in the tall grass and help her gather wild flowers for the stone altars in the village of Westphalian. These visions were vivid, filled with sensory details of light and sound that stayed with her for the rest of her life. She saw the Virgin Mary not as a distant figure in a painting, but as a lady of immense grace who brought comfort to her weary soul. Anne Catherine even experienced complex visions during these formative years, describing the essence of the Holy Trinity as 3 concentric spheres of light, each pulsing with a different intensity and brilliance. She spoke of these things with a simplicity that often baffled the adults around her. To her, the spiritual world was simply the other half of her daily existence, no more strange than the rain that watered her father's crops or the snow that covered the winter wheat during the long, dark nights. At the age of 12, the harsh realities of her poverty demanded that she leave the comforts of her home to earn her own way. She was bound out to work on a larger farm nearby, where the labor was grueling and the hours were long. Later, she moved to the town of Westphalian to learn the trade of a seamstress. In the rhythmic motion of the needle passing through fabric, she found a new kind of silence. Each stitch became a meditative pulse that allowed her mind to retreat into the interior world she had built. Even when her hands were calloused and her body was exhausted, her inner eye remained fixed on the celestial figures that continued to guide her path. She lived between two worlds, the steel of the needle and the brilliance of the light. Her journey toward the convent had begun, a path paved with both hardship and heavenly wonder that would soon lead her toward a mystery the world was not yet prepared to witness. In the year 1802, as the frost of December settled over the Westphalian landscape, Anne Catherine Emmerich finally approached the heavy timbered doors of the Augustinian convent at Agnetenburg. At 28 years of age, she carried the weight of a decade of rejection. Time and again, her poverty had been a barrier that no amount of prayer could seem to dissolve. The stone walls of Agnetenburg, gray and imposing under the winter sky, represented a sanctuary she had chased through years of labor as a seamstress. As she stepped over the threshold, the world of fields and fabric fell away, replaced by the rhythmic tolling of the bell and the scent of cold stone and ancient wax. Her entrance was not a matter of simple acceptance, but a miracle of quiet persistence. She had arrived with almost nothing, having spent her meager savings to support the family of the organist who had taught her music. It was only through the intervention of her friend, Clara Sernchen, that the doors had opened at all. Clara's family had made it a condition of her own entry that the impoverished and be taken as well. This humble beginning defined her early days within the cloister. While others brought dowries of coin and fine linens, Anne brought only her calloused hands and a spirit that seemed to burn with an intensity that the other sisters found difficult to name. Life within Agnetenburg was a study in shadows and silence. The corridors were narrow, lit only by the flickering glow of tallow candles that cast long, distorted shapes against the lime-washed walls. Anne embraced the austerity with a hunger that bordered on the desperate. She sought out the most loathsome tasks, scrubbing the flagstones until her knuckles were raw and her back ached with a dull, constant throb. The air in the chapel was always a few degrees colder than the rest of the convent, a damp chill that seeped into her wool habit as she knelt for hours in the dark. To her, every discomfort was a bridge. A way to move closer to the suffering she sensed was the core of her calling. Yet her presence began to create a quiet friction within the community. The other sisters, many of whom lived a life of moderate and comfortable devotion, were puzzled by her. They watched as she fell into sudden, deep trances, her body becoming as still and cold as the statues in the alcoves. Her piety was not a quiet thing. It was a visible, haunting force that served as a mirror to the more tepid hearts around her. They whispered in the refectory about the bright little sister who ate so little and prayed so much. Some viewed her with awe, but others felt a growing antipathy, a resentment for the way her extreme self-denial seemed to judge their own human frailties. By 1803, the year she took her formal vows, Anne's physical frame began to show the strain of her inner fire. Her health, always delicate, started to crumble under the weight of frequent illnesses that left her confined to her cell. She lay upon a thin mattress of straw, listening to the muffled sounds of the convent moving around her. The texture of the straw was a constant irritation against her skin, a physical penance she offered up in the silence of the night. In these hours of isolation, the visions that had visited her since childhood returned with a new, terrifying clarity. The walls of her cell seemed to thin, revealing glimpses of a world beyond the veil of the material. As the years moved toward 1811, Anne became a ghost within the house of Agnetenburg. She was frequently bedridden, her body a battlefield where spirit and flesh were locked in a profound struggle. The ecstasies that had once been brief now stretched into hours, leaving her drained and translucent. While the political world outside was being reshaped by the hands of emperors and the march of armies, Anne was descending into a different kind of darkness. She was being prepared, through the mundane suffering of the convent and the isolation of her sickbed, for a transformation that would soon make her name known far beyond the walls of Dulmen. The threshold of Agnetenburg was merely the beginning. The year is 1811. The political winds of Europe were shifting with a cold, unrelenting force. Napoleon Bonaparte's reach had extended deep into the heart of Westphalia, bringing with it the harsh decree of secularization. For the sisters of Agnetenburg, the walls that had once offered a holy, rhythmic silence now echoed with the heavy, unceremonious footsteps of imperial officials. Imagine the sound of thick leather boots striking the cold stone floor, the metallic rattling of iron keys, and the scent of damp ink drying on bureaucratic parchment. The convent, which had been Anne Catherine's entire world, was being systematically dismantled piece by piece. The sanctuary was shattering. It was not merely the loss of a physical home, but the violent erasure of a way of life that had stood for centuries. Anne lay in her cell, her body thin and increasingly fragile, a vessel of pain that seemed to vibrate with every distant door slam. The sisters were being scattered like autumn leaves, forced to find distant family members or sympathetic friends who could take them in. But Anne was far too weak to walk, and far too sick to be easily moved. She watched through the narrow window as the garden, once tended with prayerful, loving hands, began to overgrow with the tangled weeds of winter. The light in the hallway dimmed as the candles were no longer lit by the passing nuns. There is a specific kind of heavy silence that follows the departure of many people, a dusty, lingering quiet that settles into the very corners of a room. Anne lived in that deepening silence for weeks, essentially a ghost in an emptying house. Eventually, the day came when the last of the heavy oak doors had to be locked for good. In the early months of 1812, though the transition had begun in the gloom of 1811, Anne was finally removed from her beloved Agnetenburg. She was carried, a small bundle of bones and indomitable spirit, through the biting, cold air of the town of Dulmen. The sky that day was likely a flat, bruised shade of gray, the exact color of wet wool. The townspeople watched from behind their curtains as the sickly woman was transported. She was no longer protected by the habit or the cloister. She was a woman of the world now. Her new sanctuary was a small, sparse room in the house of a poor widow. It was located on a narrow, cramped street where the smell of coal smoke and horse manure drifted through the tiny cracks in the window frame. The room was extremely humble, containing little more than a simple bed, a small wooden table, and a single chair. The floorboards creaked under the weight of her sister, Gertrude, who had come to provide what little care she could. There was no grand altar here, no vaulted ceilings to catch her whispered prayers. Instead, there was only the rhythmic, mechanical ticking of a clock and the distant, muffled murmur of the town's daily commerce. In this tiny, cramped space, the boundaries between reality and the divine blurred. In this forced isolation, her physical suffering began to intensify in ways she could not have imagined. The wounds on her hands and her feet, which had started as subtle, reddish marks, were now becoming more pronounced and painful. The room often smelled of lavender and old wood, but there was also the distinct, metallic tang of blood in the air. She was frequently found in a state of deep ecstasy, her eyes fixed on something entirely invisible to those who stood by her bedside. Father Lambert, a French refugee priest who had stayed near her, became her primary confidant. He would sit in the dim light for hours, the two of them speaking in hushed tones while the rest of Dulmen slept. Outside, the world was in total chaos, with wars and shifting borders, but inside this small room, a different kind of storm was brewing. Despite the grinding poverty and the intense loneliness of her new surroundings, Anne did not give in to despair. She viewed the loss of the convent as a stripping away of the final layers of her earthly identity. In the deep silence of her room in Dulmen, she was being prepared for a much greater mystery. The shattering of her sanctuary was merely the opening of a door. The town, with its wet cobblestones and its quiet, snowy winters, would soon become the center of a spiritual phenomenon that would draw the eyes of the entire world. For now, there was only the cold and the waiting. The winter of 1812 arrived with a bone-deep chill that seemed to settle permanently into the stones of Dulmen. Inside a humble, shadowed room, Anne Catherine lay in a silence so thick it felt heavy against her skin. The world outside was a tapestry of war and freezing winds, but her world had shrunk to the four walls of her sanctuary. The air in her chamber was thin and smelled of damp wool, and the faint, sweet scent of drying herbs. She was alone, caught in the grip of a fever that burned despite the frost creeping across the window pane in delicate, jagged patterns. It was during these quiet, frozen days that the internal storm she had carried for so long finally broke the surface of her flesh. On the afternoon of December 29th, at exactly 3 o'clock, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The gray light of the winter sun seemed to focus into a single, piercing point of clarity. As she knelt in prayer, a vision unfurled before her eyes, a young man, radiant and yet draped in the shadows of sorrow. From his wounds, 3 distinct rays of light, colored the deep, visceral red of fresh blood, darted through the air. They moved with the speed of thought, striking her palms, her feet, and her right side simultaneously. The impact was not a gentle touch. It was a searing, white-hot heat that felt as though molten lead had been poured into her very marrow. The pain was immediate and absolute, a blinding flash that left her breathless on the floor. When she finally looked down at her hands, she saw the impossible. In the center of each palm, the skin had parted to reveal wounds shaped like small, perfect triangles. They were not jagged tears, but precise, as if marked by an unseen architect. Blood began to well up, thick and dark, contrasting sharply with the pale, translucent skin of her hands. The sensation was that of a constant, rhythmic pulsing, a second heartbeat that throbbed at the sites of the injury. Each breath she took seemed to fan the flames of a fire that lived inside her joints, turning her fingers into instruments of agony. Her feet mirrored the agony of her hands, with wounds that made the simple act of standing feel like walking on shards of broken glass. But it was the wound on her side that carried a different weight. Over her heart, a mark had already begun to form earlier that year, a cross that seemed to rise from beneath the skin. Now, it was joined by a deeper lance-like opening that bled with a steady, quiet persistence. The blood would seep into her linen shifts, creating heavy, damp patches that she tried desperately to conceal. She felt as though her body was no longer her own, but a living map of a journey taken centuries before, etched in salt and iron. In her isolation, Anne Catherine fought to keep the mystery contained within her room. She used scraps of cloth to bind the wounds, moving with a slow, agonizing caution to avoid making a sound that might alert the household. She wanted the suffering to be hers alone, a private bridge between her soul and the divine. However, the physical reality of the stigmata could not be hidden by silence. It was the landlady's young daughter who first broke the veil of secrecy. Entering the room to bring a small comfort, the girl froze at the sight of the blood-stained bedding and the red marks on Anne's hands. The secret was out, and the quiet winter of the cross was about to become a public spectacle. The news rippled through the town like a cold current. People began to whisper of the nun who bled from the hands of Christ, turning her quiet cell into a place of pilgrimage and scrutiny. For Anne, this was a new kind of cross, the loss of her cherished solitude. She lay in the flickering candlelight, listening to the murmurs in the hallway, feeling the air grow heavy with the expectations of the curious. The physical pain remained a constant companion, a sharp reminder of the cost of her visions. As the year 1812 drew to a close, she was no longer just a daughter of the church. She was a vessel, bearing the marks of a story that refused to stay buried in the past. The winter of 1812 was a season of deepening silence in the village of Dulmen. Yet within the small, dim room where Anne Catherine Emmerich lay, the air felt charged with a heavy, restless energy. The wounds on her hands and feet were no longer the only signs of her struggle. One evening, As the shadows stretched long across the floorboards, a new sensation took hold, a crushing pressure around her brow, as if an invisible band were being tightened. She would later describe a vision where she was offered a choice between a crown of roses and a crown of thorns. She reached for the thorns, and the physical reality of that choice began to manifest in a series of rhythmic, painful pulses against her skin. Small, circular punctures began to bloom across her forehead, tracing a path through her hairline. These were not mere scratches. They were deep points that released dark droplets of blood. The blood did not merely trickle, but seemed to well up and pause, as if each drop carried the weight of a separate sorrow. Her attendants watched in a terrified awe as the white linen of her headdress was slowly overtaken by crimson blossoms. The scent of copper filled the small space, mingling with the faint, sweet aroma of beeswax from a nearby candle. To Anne Catherine, the pain was a searing heat, a fire that burned away the world outside, leaving only the sharp rhythm of her own suffering. As the crown of thorns took its place, another mark revealed itself beneath her clothing. Above her heart, a distinct double cross appeared upon her skin. It was not a sudden wound, but a gradual inflammation that eventually broke the surface. This mark was a vibrant, bruised purple at its edges, fading into a raw, tender red at the center. On certain days, particularly toward Friday, the cross would grow hot to the touch, and a clear, pale fluid would seep from the broken skin before turning to blood. The skin around it was often swollen and stretched, yet she bore this agony with a stillness that was perhaps more unsettling than any cry of pain could have been. The domestic peace of the house was soon fractured. Her sister and the few friends permitted to care for her moved with a frantic urgency. They spent hours wringing out cloths in basins of cold water, the splashing sound echoing against the stone walls. There was a desperate attempt to keep the news within the house, a desire to protect the fragile woman from the prying eyes of the world. They would change her linens in the middle of the night, the damp fabric heavy and cold. But blood is a difficult secret to keep. It stained the discarded wash water and lingered in the whispers of the laundrywomen. Soon, the barrier between the sick room and the street dissolved. By the spring of 1813, Dulmen was no longer a place of quiet routine. The nun who bled from the head and chest was on every tongue. In the local taverns and on the steps of the church, the community was divided. Some spoke of her with a reverent, fearful tone, believing the divine had touched their small corner of Westphalia. Others harbored a growing resentment. They saw her not as a saint, but as a source of unwanted attention or a clever actress seeking to deceive the pious. The air in the streets became thick with a new tension, a collective anticipation that demanded some form of proof for the miracles occurring behind closed doors. The whispers reached the ears of the authorities, and the first investigators arrived with the clinical coldness of a winter wind. These were men of science, and the law carrying leather satchels filled with magnifying glasses and ledgers. They entered the sick room with a skeptical air, their boots clattering on the floor where only soft footsteps had trodden. They demanded to see the wounds, to touch the skin, and to witness the blood for themselves. Anne Catherine lay amidst this intrusion, her body a silent map of a journey they could not understand. The stage was set for a confrontation between the seen and the unseen, as the mystery moved into the harsh light of public scrutiny. Dr. Franz Wessener stepped into the room in the early spring of 1813. The door creaked on its hinges, a sharp, lonely sound that cut through the heavy silence of the small cottage in Dulmen. Wessener was a man of the Enlightenment, a district physician whose world was built on the tangible, the measurable, and the cold facts of human anatomy. He carried with him a leather bag filled with polished silver probes, glass vials, and the unwavering belief that every mystery possessed a rational, physical cause. The room was dim, lit only by a single candle that flickered against the damp stone walls, casting long, skeletal shadows over the bed where Anne Catherine lay. The air was peculiar, not the expected stench of a sick room, but something strangely clean, underscored by a faint, metallic scent that tickled the back of his throat. He set his bag down with a heavy thud, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to dismantle what he was certain was a pious fraud. He began his examination with the hands, pulling back the thin, coarse sheets to reveal her palms. There, centered perfectly between the bones, were the marks. They were not jagged lacerations, but neat, circular depressions, nearly the size of a thumb's breadth, as if a heavy, square-headed iron nail had been pressed into the flesh and left there to stay. Wessener leaned in, his spectacles sliding slightly down his nose. He expected to see the telltale signs of inflammation, the angry red swelling, the heat radiating from the skin, or the accumulation of yellow pus that follows a wound exposed to the air. But there was nothing. The surrounding skin was as pale and cool as translucent marble. The wounds themselves were deep and open, yet they did not weep the fluids of a dying body. They were terrifyingly fresh, as if time itself had frozen at the moment of the strike. Moving his gaze upward, Wessener turned his attention to her forehead. Beneath a simple linen band, he discovered a series of small, puncture-like wounds that circled her brow. It was the mark of the crown of thorns. He watched as a single drop of blood formed at the temple, tracing a slow, rhythmic path down her cheek. He took a piece of clean gauze and wiped it away, expecting to see a scratch or a prick from a hidden needle. Underneath the blood, the skin was punctured, but the source of the bleeding remained invisible to his clinical eye. There was no iron, no thorn, no shard of glass. He searched her bedding, turning over the straw mattress and checking the folds of her habit for any sharp instrument she might use to pierce herself in the dark. He found nothing but the scent of old lavender and the dry, shivering rustle of the pallet. His frustration began to grow, a knot in his stomach that science could not yet untie. It was the mark upon her chest, however, that truly challenged the physician's resolve. He moved the fabric of her garment aside to inspect her sternum. There, etched into the skin, was a double cross, a larger one overlaid by a smaller, more intricate shape. It was not a superficial scratch. The mark appeared to be part of the skin's very texture, a raised, reddish-purple branding that pulsed with a life of its own. Wessener took a sponge dipped in harsh vinegar and water, scrubbing the area with a vigor that should have caused the woman to cry out. Anne Catherine remained still, her eyes closed in a state of deep, unmoving prayer. When he pulled the sponge away, the silent double cross remained, unchanged and defiant. It was not paint. It was not blood applied to the surface. It was a biological anomaly that defied every textbook he had ever studied in the great halls of medicine. As the hours turned into days, Wessener's skepticism was forced to contend with a terrifying lack of natural decay. He noted in his journals that the wounds, despite being open for years, never succumbed to the merciless rot that claimed the flesh of other bedridden patients. There were no bedsores, no gangrene, no foul odors. The blood that flowed from her side on Fridays was bright, arterial, and seemingly endless, yet her pulse remained a ghostly, thin thread that should not have been able to sustain such a loss. He began to feel less like a doctor and more like an intruder in a sanctuary. He would sit in the corner of the room, the rhythmic scratching of his quill the only accompaniment to the heavy atmosphere. He watched her for hours, hoping to catch a hand reaching for a hidden tool or a conspirator slipping a vial into her bed. But he saw only a woman who lived on nothing but water. By the time the sun set on his first week of observation, the physician's gaze had shifted. The clinical coldness he had brought with him had begun to thaw into a profound, unsettling wonder. He looked at his instruments and saw them for what they were, crude toys in the face of a mystery that transcended the physical realm. The wounds did not follow the laws of circulation or the rules of healing. They followed a calendar of pain that aligned with an ancient history nearly 2,000 years old. As he packed his bag to leave for the night, Wessener looked back at the small, fragile figure on the bed. He had come to find a fraud, but instead, he had found a mirror reflecting the limits of his own understanding. The mystery of the stigmata remained, an open wound in the heart of his scientific world, refusing to be closed by any earthly logic. By the spring of 1813, the whispers that had once been confined to the small, shadowed corners of the widow's house in Dulmen began to take on a life of their own. News of the bleeding nun did not just travel. It rippled across the plains of Westphalia like a stone cast into a still pond. At first, it was a secret shared between neighbors over low garden fences, then a murmur in the bustling marketplaces of Münster. People spoke of the sister who bore the marks of the Passion, a woman who lived on nothing but the thin air of prayer and the grace of the Eucharist. This was no longer a private agony. The walls of her small room, once a sanctuary of silence, were now the center of a gathering storm. The quiet, pastoral life of the town was being pulled into the orbit of something much larger and far more dangerous than a local miracle. Imagine the atmosphere of Dulmen as the first waves of the curious arrived. The town, accustomed to the slow rhythm of the seasons and the heavy tolling of church bells, suddenly found its narrow streets choked with the clatter of carriage wheels and the heavy thud of wooden clogs. The air was thick with the scent of damp wool and the steam of horses. Pilgrims came from leagues away, their faces etched with a desperate, hungry hope. They gathered beneath Anne Catherine's window, standing in the gray mist of early morning, their rosaries clicking like 1,000 small insects. They didn't just want to pray, they wanted to see. They wanted to witness the impossible with their own eyes, to find proof that the divine still touched the earth in an age increasingly defined by the cold machinery of war and reason. But the crowds were not composed entirely of the faithful. Mixed among the devout were the skeptics, the scholars, and the merely opportunistic. Merchants began to realize that where there was a miracle, there was also a market. Local inns that had stood half-empty for years were suddenly filled to the rafters, their floors covered in the straw of weary travelers. In the taverns, the conversation was a frantic mix of theological debate and local gossip. Some laughed, calling it a clever ruse by the clergy to regain the power lost when the convents were shuttered. Others watched the windows of the widow's house with a clinical, predatory intensity, waiting for a single slip, a single drop of ink or red dye that would expose the bright little sister as a fraud. The town had become a stage, and every resident of Dulmen found themselves cast as an extra in a drama they did not fully understand. The church, sensing the growing instability, could no longer remain on the sidelines. Vicar General Bernard Overberg, a man known for his deep intellect and cautious soul, was dispatched to bring order to the chaos. He arrived not with the fanfare of a conqueror, but with the quiet, heavy authority of the law. Overberg was a man of the Enlightenment as much as he was a man of God, and he understood that a false miracle could be more damaging to the faith than an outright persecution. He brought with him 3 physicians, men whose hands were stained with the scent of vinegar and herbs, tasked with applying the cold logic of medicine to the heat of a religious frenzy. They were to be the filters through which this mystery would pass, separating the spiritual gold from the dross of human imagination. While the town outside teemed with noise and expectation, the room where Anne Catherine lay remained a strange, frozen world. Inside those 4 walls, the light fell across the floor in long, dusty shafts, and the only sound was the shallow, rhythmic breathing of the bedridden nun. To her, the crowds outside were a distant, dull roar, like the sound of a sea she would never again reach. She lived in a perpetual state of dual existence, one foot in the gritty reality of 19th century Germany, and the other in the vivid, painful landscapes of her visions. When the physicians entered her room for the first time, they found a woman who seemed more spirit than flesh. She did not greet them with the fervor of a zealot, but with a weary, patient humility that unnerved them. Her skin was as pale as the linens she rested upon, making the sudden, dark bloom of blood on her hands, seem like a violent intrusion from another world. This was the beginning of the siege. The Prussian authorities, always suspicious of Catholic fervor in their newly acquired territories, watched from the shadows with narrowing eyes. They saw the crowds not as pilgrims, but as a potential mob, a spark that could ignite a fire of rebellion against the secular state. The tension in Dülmen was palpable, a thin wire stretched to the breaking point. The town was no longer just a place on a map. It was a laboratory for the soul, where the old world of miracles collided with the new world of administration. As the first official investigation began its work, the people waited. They watched the closed doors of the widow's house, listening for a verdict that would either sanctify the ground they stood on or cast them all back into the darkness of a disenchanted world. The air was heavy with the coming storm, and in the center of it all, a single woman lay still, her blood marking the time. The air in the small town of Dülmen grew heavy as the month of August 1819 reached its peak. The tension between the fervor of the faithful and the cold, rational skepticism of the Prussian state had finally reached a breaking point. For years, the stories of Anne Catherine's wounds had spread like a slow-burning fire through the countryside, drawing pilgrims and curiosity seekers alike. But to the authorities in Berlin, this was not a miracle. It was a disorder, a potential spark for civil unrest, and above all, a possible fraud that needed to be dismantled by the steady hands of science and law. The siege that had begun at her bedside was about to take a far more clinical and aggressive turn. They would no longer watch from a distance. They would take her into their own hands. The Prussian government issued a decree that was as sharp and uncompromising as a surgeon's blade. Anne Catherine was to be removed from her familiar surroundings and placed under a strict, secular investigation. On a humid morning, she was lifted from her bed and transported to a house owned by a local official, a neutral ground where no priest could offer comfort and no family member could slip her a secret morsel of food. Landrat von Berninghausen, the district administrator, stood at the threshold of the new room. He was a man of logic and duty, his coat buttoned tight against the warmth of the summer, his face a mask of professional indifference. He carried with him a commission of doctors and officials, men whose eyes were trained to find the hidden seam in a lie, the smudge of red dye on a fingertip, or the secret pocket where a blade might be hidden. The room they chose for her was sparse, stripped of the religious icons that usually surrounded her. There were no heavy velvet curtains or soft carpets to muffle the sounds of the world outside. Instead, there was the constant, rhythmic scratching of quills on parchment as the observers recorded every breath she took. For 3 weeks, 21 long, agonizing days, the surveillance never wavered. 2 guards or officials were stationed in her room at every hour of the day and night. They sat in hard-backed chairs, their shadows stretching long across the floor as the candlelight flickered, watching her through the small hours when the human spirit is at its most vulnerable. They watched the rise and fall of her chest, the twitching of her eyelids, and the way her hands rested upon the coarse white sheets. The medical men, including Dr. von Druffel and Dr. Busch, approached her bed with a clinical coldness that bordered on the macabre. They did not see a woman in pain. They saw a puzzle to be solved. They examined the wounds on her hands and feet with magnifying lenses, searching for signs of self-infliction or chemical irritation. They wiped away the blood that seeped from the marks of the crown of thorns upon her brow, only to sit in silence and wait for it to return. They noted the metallic scent of the blood and the way the skin appeared to tear from within, rather than from without. Every few hours, they would check the seals they had placed on the doors and windows, ensuring that no accomplice could have entered during a moment of distraction. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ticking of a heavy wooden clock that marked the passage of her ordeal. One of the most profound points of their inquiry was her total fast. For years, It was claimed that Anne Catherine consumed nothing but the thin wafer of the Eucharist. To the Prussian Commission, this was a physiological impossibility that would surely be exposed within days. They monitored her water pitcher with the precision of chemists, measuring every drop to ensure she was not drinking in secret. They searched the bedding, the floorboards, and even the folds of her clothing for crumbs of bread. As the first week bled into the second, and the second into the third, the doctors grew increasingly unsettled. Her body grew weaker, her pulse fluttered like the wings of a trapped bird, yet she did not die. She did not even ask for water. She lay there, a pale ghost of a woman, enduring their scrutiny with a terrifying patience that seemed to defy the very laws of nature they sought to uphold. As the final days of the 3-week inquiry approached, the atmosphere in the house changed. The initial confidence of the commission had begun to erode, replaced by a restless, uneasy frustration. They had found no hidden instruments, no vials of blood, and no evidence of a secret diet. They had watched her through the deepest dark of night and the brightest glare of noon, and they had found nothing but a woman who seemed to be leaking her life's blood onto the linens without a visible cause. The landrat himself found his skepticism challenged by the sheer consistency of her condition. When the 21 days finally ended, the commission prepared to leave, their ledgers filled with thousands of words of observation, yet without the one conclusion they had been sent to find. The Prussian inquiry, intended to be the final word on her fraud, had instead become a silent witness to a mystery that refused to be solved. As the heavy boots of the commission members finally faded into the distance, leaving the small house in Dulmen once again to its quiet rhythms, one might have expected Anne Catherine to find peace. But for a woman whose life was a constant bridge to the infinite, silence was never truly empty. In the autumn of 1818, a new figure appeared on the horizon, one who would change the course of her legacy forever. A carriage rattled over the damp cobblestones, carrying a man whose soul was as turbulent as the revolutionary era he lived in. His name was Clemens Brentano. He was a celebrated poet, a darling of the German Romantic movement, and a man who had spent his life chasing shadows and light in the halls of literature, yet finding no rest for his weary spirit. Clemens was 40 years old when he arrived at Anne Catherine's bedside, a man of sharp intellect and restless, nervous energy. He had come at the suggestion of friends, perhaps out of simple curiosity, or perhaps out of a desperate, unspoken need for a truth that could not be found in rhymes or metaphors. When he first stepped into her dim room, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and the faint, metallic tang of blood from her recurring stigmata. He expected to find a peasant woman lost in delirium. Instead, he found a woman who looked at him with eyes that seemed to have known him for a lifetime. Before he could even introduce himself, it is said she greeted him as the one God had promised, the scribe who would finally catch her fleeting words before they vanished into the ether. From that moment on, the poet and the mystic were bound together in a labor that would last 6 years. Clemens moved into a nearby apartment and became a fixture in her sick room, his presence almost as constant as the shadows on the wall. He would sit by her bed for hours, his knees cramped in the small space, his fingers stained with dark ink that never seemed to dry. The process was painstaking and rhythmic. Anne Catherine did not speak the refined German of the ivory towers. She spoke in a thick, earthy Westphalian dialect, her voice often a mere whisper through parched lips. Clemens would listen, transfixed, as she described the dust of ancient Jerusalem or the texture of the stones in a house in Ephesus that no living person had seen in centuries. He was more than a secretary. He was a bridge between her ecstatic visions and the waiting world. The atmosphere of those sessions was one of intense, almost suffocating intimacy. Imagine the flickery golden light of a single candle casting long, dancing shadows against the whitewashed walls of the cottage. The only sound in the room was the rhythmic, soft scratching of a quill pen across parchment, a sound that Anne Catherine came to associate with the duty of her suffering. She would often slip into deep ecstasies while speaking, her body stiffening as her mind wandered through the scenes of the Passion. Clemens would wait, his pen poised, capturing every detail as they tumbled out. The number of lashes, the color of a robe, or the expression of a face in a crowd 2,000 years gone. He eventually filled 16,000 pages with these observations, creating a mountain of paper that documented a hidden history of the soul. Yet this partnership was not without its own set of shadows. Clemens was a writer by nature, and writers are often prone to the lure of the perfect sentence. Over the years, critics and church officials would whisper that the scribe of shadows had added too much of his own color to the nun's visions. They wondered where the simple, unlettered faith of Anne Catherine ended and the dramatic flair of the romantic poet began. Was the recorded passion truly her pure experience, or was it filtered through his literary imagination? This tension created a complex tapestry, a record of divine mystery intertwined with human artifice. He saw himself as a humble servant of her grace, yet he could not help but polish the rough gems she gave him into something that would shine for the masses. As 1824 approached, the end of their long collaboration drew near. Anne Catherine's physical frame was failing, the light in her eyes dimming as the wounds of the stigmata grew deeper and her strength ebbed away. Clemens stayed by her side until the very end, a faithful sentinel guarding a treasure he only half understood. When she finally passed, he was left with trunks full of notebooks, the echoes of a voice that had now joined the eternal silence of the saints. He spent the rest of his life, until his own death in 1842, trying to organize this chaotic flood of revelation into something the world could hold. He had become the permanent custodian of her shadows, a man forever haunted and transformed by the visions of a woman who had seen the world not as it is, but as it was intended to be. In the quiet corners of Dulmen, the air inside the small room was often heavy with the scent of old wood and the soft, rhythmic scratching of a quill against parchment. Anne Catherine Emmerich lay motionless, her fragile frame barely disturbing the sheets, yet her spirit was far from that bedside. As the candle flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls, she began to speak. Her voice was a mere whisper, a thread of sound that pulled the listener across thousands of miles and nearly 2,000 years of history. Beside her, the poet Clemens Brentano sat in rapt silence, his hand moving quickly to capture every word, every sigh, and every agonizing detail of the scenes unfolding before her sightless eyes. This collaboration was the crucible of her legacy. Anne did not merely describe stories she had heard. She spoke as a witness to a living reality. She felt the dry, searing heat of the Judean sun on her skin and the rough grit of the desert sand beneath her feet. In her trances, the walls of her room vanished, replaced by the towering, ancient gates of Jerusalem. She described the city not as a series of ruins, but as a bustling, crowded metropolis, filled with the sounds of merchants, the clatter of Roman sandals, and the heavy atmosphere of a city on the brink of upheaval. She spoke of the specific architecture, the height of the walls, and the way the light hit the golden ornaments of the temple at the hour of noon, providing a vividness that felt entirely tangible. Her most intense visions centered on what would become known as the Dolorous Passion. She followed the figure of Jesus into the Garden of Gethsemane, describing the gnarled, silver-leafed olive trees with a clarity that seemed impossible for someone who had never left the green fields of Germany. She spoke of the cold night dew and the heavy, suffocating silence of the garden before the betrayal. As she watched the agony of the garden, her own body would often convulse, her stigmata weeping in sympathy with the spiritual wounds she observed. She counted the blows of the Roman scourges, recording 5,466 strikes, a number that left Brentano trembling as he wrote, his ink staining the pages in the dim light. What fascinated later scholars were the topographical details that Anne provided, many of which contradicted the popular beliefs of her time, but were later supported by archaeological findings. She described the Hill of Calvary as being steep on its eastern side, but possessing a gentle slope to the west, where a field lay near the road to Emmaus. She spoke of the tomb of Christ, noting that the interior rock was a pale, white stone streaked with distinct veins of red and blue. These were not the vague descriptions of a dreamer, but the precise observations of a surveyor, detailing the distance between the cross and the sepulchre with startling confidence. She saw the dust on the stones and the precise angle of the shadows falling over the sacred ground. Perhaps her most enduring legacy was her description of the final years of the Virgin Mary. Anne claimed that after the crucifixion, the Apostle John had built a small, square stone house for Mary on a hill near Ephesus. She described a specific mountain overlooking the sea, hidden among groves of trees, with a fresh spring of water nearby. In 1881, more than 50 years after Anne's death, a French priest used her detailed accounts to search the hillsides of Turkey. To the world's astonishment, he discovered a small, ancient structure that matched her description in every detail, right down to the mountain's unique vantage point and the presence of the hidden spring. It was a place she had only ever seen through the eyes of the spirit. As the visions of the Passion reached their climax, Anne's physical strength seemed to ebb away, as if the sheer weight of the history she was witnessing was crushing her. She described the darkness that fell over the land, the texture of the burial cloths, and the profound silence of the tomb. For Anne, these were not distant myths, but a burden she carried in her very flesh. The words she left behind became a tapestry of sensory experiences, a bridge between the mystical and the material that continues to haunt and inspire. Her journey through the shadows of the past was nearly complete, leaving the world to wonder at the source of her sight, while the candle in her room finally flickered and died. The winter air of 1824 pressed heavily against the small window panes of the house in Dulmen. Inside, the room was filled with a stillness that seemed to vibrate with the weight of the visions that had passed through it. Anne Catherine lay small and fragile beneath the linens, her body having become a mere vessel, translucent and worn by the intensity of her spiritual journey. The light in the room was often dim, filtered through the gray clouds of a Westphalian winter, casting long, soft shadows across the floorboards where Clemens Brentano sat. His pen remained poised, waiting for a whisper that grew increasingly faint as the weeks turned into the final days of her earthly pilgrimage. As January gave way to the biting cold of February, the physical toll on Anne Catherine became absolute. She had long since ceased to find any nourishment in the food of the world, her existence sustained by little more than sips of water and the daily reception of the Eucharist. Her skin, once marked by the vivid, weeping wounds of the stigmata, now appeared like aged parchment. The marks themselves had become dry and pale, as if the blood had finally retreated to the very core of her heart. Every breath was a soft, labored prayer, a shallow, rhythmic pulse that filled the quiet room. The people of the town whispered of her condition, but inside the house, there was only the sound of the wind rattling the frames and the occasional crackle of a dying fire. Brentano watched her with a mixture of reverence and sorrow. He saw the way her eyes, though clouded by pain, would occasionally sharpen, as if looking through the walls of the small room into another landscape entirely. She spoke less now, her voice a mere thread of sound that required him to lean close, his ear almost touching her lips to catch the names of saints or descriptions of the ancient hills of Jerusalem. The room smelled of beeswax and the faint, clean scent of cold air. There was no grandeur in these moments, only the profound intimacy of a soul preparing to depart. She seemed to be untying the knots of her life, one by one, with a patience that defied the agony of her failing organs. On the morning of February 9th, 1824, the atmosphere in the cottage shifted. The restlessness that had characterized her final weeks settled into a deep, impenetrable calm. Those present in the room felt a change in the very air, a settling of the dust, a softening of the morning light. Anne Catherine did not struggle. Her transition was as quiet as the fall of snow on the graves outside. As the clock marked the passing hours, her breathing slowed further, the intervals between each inhalation growing longer and more profound. When the final breath eventually left her body at 8:30 in the evening, it was so gentle that for a few moments, the observers did not realize she had crossed the threshold. The stigmata, those mysterious windows into her devotion, remained as silent witnesses on her still, cold hands. The news of her passing traveled through Dulmen like a low hum. There was no spectacle, only a collective indrawing of breath from the community that had watched her suffer and prophesy for so long. Preparations for her burial were conducted with the same simplicity that had marked her life. Her body was placed in a modest wooden coffin, and the townspeople gathered to pay their respects, many of them touched by the sense of peace that seemed to emanate from her even in death. The winter ground was hard and unforgiving, requiring great effort to prepare the final resting place in the parish cemetery. On the day she was laid to rest, the sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the sound of the shovels against the earth was the only rhythm that broke the solemn silence. As the earth was returned to the grave, covering the wooden lid of the casket, a sense of completion descended upon those who had remained by her side. Anne Catherine Emmerich was gone from the physical world, leaving behind volumes of recorded visions and a legacy of mystery that would endure for centuries. The wounds that had defined her later years were now hidden beneath the soil of Westphalia, resting in the quiet dark. Though rumors would later lead to the opening of this grave, on this evening, there was only the stillness of the cemetery. The house in Dulmen stood empty of her presence, but the echoes of her journey remained, etched into the memories of the scribe and the faithful who had witnessed her long, slow departure into the light. The soil of Dulmen had long since settled over the quiet resting place of the mystic, and the memory of her bleeding wounds had transitioned from a living scandal into a silent history. Decades passed, 6, then nearly 7 decades of stillness. Yet, while the physical body of Anne Catherine Emmerich returned to the earth, the words she whispered in her feverish trances lived a strange, restless life. Within the pages transcribed by Clemens Brentano, there were descriptions so geographically specific they seemed to demand a physical reckoning. Among these was the account of a small stone house near Ephesus, a place she had never visited, yet described with the confidence of a resident. In the year 1881, a French priest named Father Julien Gouillet felt the tug of these descriptions. Armed with a copy of the visions, he traveled to the rugged coast of Turkey. Imagine the dry heat of the Aegean summer, the air thick with the scent of wild herbs and the hum of cicadas. He climbed the slopes of Mount Coressos, his cassock catching on the thorny scrub. He was looking for a ghost of a building, a structure that most believed existed only in legend. After days of searching, he discovered a small, ruined stone chapel. It matched the descriptions perfectly, but his reports were initially met with cold indifference. 10 years later, in 1891, the story found its way to 2 Lazarist priests, Father Henry Jung and Father Eugene Poulin. They were skeptics, initially intending to disprove the visions entirely. Encouraged by Sister Marie de Mandat-Grancy, they set out on the 29th of July. They carried the book like a compass, tracing the contours of the land against the text. They sought a place where one could see both the city of Ephesus and the sea, a detail Anne had described with peculiar insistence. As they climbed the sun-drenched incline of the mountain, their breathing grew heavy in the thin air. They reached a small plateau, a hidden fold in the ancient terrain. There, nestled among ancient olive trees, they found a rectangular house, a shell of stones weathered by centuries of wind. It was built of thick, unhewn rock, yet it possessed an undeniable gravity. As they stood there, they noticed a spring of water bubbling up from beneath the foundations, just as the mystic had promised. They consulted the book once more. Anne had described a hearth in the center and a view toward the distant, shimmering blue of the sea. Every detail aligned. Local Orthodox Christians had known of this place for generations, calling it the Door of the Virgin. They made a pilgrimage here every year on the 15th of August, unaware of the mystic. The priests spent days at the site, their skepticism dissolving into awe. They paced the dimensions, feeling the cool, rough texture of the stones. These were stones that had seen the rise of empires, yet remained tucked away in this mountain sanctuary. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rustle of leaves. It was a place suspended in time. Anne had spoken of the Virgin Mary seeking refuge here from the turmoil of Jerusalem. She described the small window, the way light would fall across the floor, and the peacefulness of the woods. To stand within those walls was to step inside the very mind of the woman who had bled in a small room in Westphalia. Today, the House of the Virgin Mary remains a place of quiet pilgrimage. The investigation that began with a bedridden woman's whispers resulted in a tangible sanctuary where thousands come to hang prayers on a stone wall. It is one of the most compelling mysteries of the Stigmata. Not the blood on the skin, but the knowledge of the earth the visionary should not have possessed. As the sun sets over the Aegean, casting purple shadows across the mountain, the house stands as a testament to the bridge between the seen and the unseen. The echoes of Anne's visions continue to vibrate within these ancient walls, proving some truths are found in the shadowed corners of a dreaming mind. We begin our final reflection in the late summer of 1819. For 3 long weeks, a small, dimly lit room in a private house became a laboratory of faith and skepticism. Anne Catherine was removed from her familiar surroundings and placed under the constant, unblinking surveillance of a government commission. Imagine the scene. A woman whose body was failing her, surrounded day and night by men who searched for a trick, for a vial of blood hidden in her bedsheets, or for the scratch of a needle. 3 physicians, including her own doctor, Franz Wilhelm Wessener, watched as the wounds on her hands and feet reopened on Fridays, exactly as she had predicted. They watched her drink only water and swallow nothing but the holy wafer, yet she did not wither away entirely. The air in that room must have been thick with the scent of lavender and the heavy, clinical silence of men trying to solve an impossible puzzle. The medical reports from that era are fascinating in their frustration. The doctors documented the cross-shaped marks on her chest and the rhythmic bleeding of her head, yet they could find no earthly cause. They were caught in a gap between the Enlightenment's demand for proof and the ancient mystery of the Stigmata. While some investigators were convinced of her sincerity, the official government report eventually labeled the case a fraud, though it notably failed to explain how such a fraud was committed. This tension between the seen and the unseen remains at the heart of her legacy. We are left to wonder about the power of the mind over the body, or perhaps the power of something much deeper. Even today, science struggles to categorize the phenomenon of the stigmatist, leaving a space where only belief or profound curiosity can reside. Then there is the shadow of the poet, Clemens Brentano. He arrived at her bedside as a skeptic, but stayed for 5 years, his charcoal pencil moving across paper with a restless, rhythmic scratching. He recorded thousands of pages of her visions, which would later be published as The Dolorous Passion. But as we look back, we must tread carefully through his words. History has revealed that Brentano was not merely a secretary. He was an architect of narrative. Scholars have found evidence that he embellished her whispers with his own poetic flourishes, perhaps even incorporating details from travel guides and maps to give her visions of the Holy Land a sharper, more realistic edge. This controversy followed her into the modern era, creating a complicated barrier between the true voice of the nun and the romanticized version, presented to the world by a man obsessed with her mystery. The journey to formal recognition by the Church was a slow-moving tide spanning nearly 2 centuries. It reached its peak on October 3, 2004. In the sun-drenched expanse of St. Peter's Square, Pope John Paul II declared Anne Catherine Emmerich blessed. The Vatican set aside the controversial books by Brentano, acknowledging they could not be certain which words were truly hers. Instead, they focused on her heroic virtue, her patience during 49 years of illness, and her dedication to prayer. This was not an approval of every vision, but an honoring of the woman who bore suffering with grace. The bells of Dülmen rang out that day, echoing across the German countryside, signaling a final validation of the woman who had spent her life in a small, darkened room. Today, if you were to travel to the town of Dülmen, you would find her resting in the Church of the Holy Cross. It is a place of profound simplicity, built of orange and yellow stone that glows softly in the afternoon light. Her remains were moved here in 1975, brought from a nearby cemetery where her grave had once been opened twice by officials searching for proof of a rumored theft. Now she lies in a quiet crypt, away from the storms of public scrutiny. The tomb is a place of pilgrimage for those who seek comfort. The atmosphere is one of deep, resonant peace. The flickering candles cast light on the stone, reminding us that while the body is fragile, the impact of a quiet life can echo through the centuries. As we step away from the bedside of the mystic, the questions that once burned so brightly begin to soften. Whether her wounds were a miracle of the spirit or a mystery of the human mind, her story remains a testament to the enduring power of faith. We leave her now in the stillness of her German resting place, where the whispers have finally stopped and the long years of pain have been traded for eternal rest. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.